Hello, everyone. My name is Mickey, and welcome to Mick MMA. Today, I wanted to talk about why are we still in the UFC Apex. For years now, the UFC has been using and abusing the UFC Apex Center. In 2019, the UFC Apex Center was built during time of COVID to help keep the ball rolling and help keep the show going. At first, it was a brilliant idea because of the restrictions of COVID, as well as, like I said, keeping things going and having a place for all these huge and epic fights to happen during the time of COVID. Before COVID, the UFC was kind of in a weird era of being, decently popular and mainstream, but not as popular as during the time of Connor. During this time of COVID was one of the first times that I was really, keeping my eyes glued to the screen for a UFC fight. It was UFC 249 Ferguson versus Gaethje, and the punches that were thrown in that fight were just absolutely insane. And they were especially haunting because of no one there and the loud sound of the punches we're making against Tony Ferguson. God rest his soul, Tony Ferguson. That fight took years off of his life. Anyways, I remember the fight very vividly because there was no one in the arena and I was surrounded by my family at the time because that was the only thing to watch. COVID massively helped out the UFC by making it the only sport on air for everyone to watch. Some really massive fights happened during this era too, like Miocic versus Cormier 3, Paulo Costa versus Izzy, and all of these fights would have benefited from a crowd. Unfortunately, at the time, COVID was still going on, so Fight Island and the UFC Apex had to be used for these big fights. Perfectly understandable at the time. Obviously, there's restrictions for certain fighters not to go places, so they had the Abu Dhabi for all of your European and Middle Eastern fighters and Russian fighters to fight at. And then you had your UFC Apex for all of your Western fighters and, a couple of other fighters that can make it to America. So it had a good ball rolling from about, 2020 to 2022, where, the Apex and Fight Island were used quite often and to the benefit of the UFC, being it was the only thing to watch at the time. Although a lot of good happened during this time, uh, large, I'd say, you know, big part of the UFC began to get lazy with its production. The UFC Apex then started to have UFC Vegas fight nights. And at first, the fight nights were pretty good, pretty stacked. You had some good contenders on there and a couple ranked fights that were pretty meaningful. But throughout the years, fans have started to notice that the quality of the cards have started to dip a lot. Basically, we are at Mackenzie Dern versus Aminda Ribas 2 to open up 2025. And if you ask me, that is a poor, sad excuse to start off 2025 with. People already don't want to watch the UFC Apex fight nights because of the stigma against them. Many other, YouTubers and fight fans will all tell you that UFC Apex fight nights, are just generally something that you can skip. You don't really got to watch. There's no stakes in them. And that's something that's been bothering me about these fight nights. I feel like, before COVID, UFC was a lot more out on the road doing things and going to these smaller venues and stuff. And now, although the UFC has traveled a lot this year, I mean, the most notable thing I could think of is Abu Dhabi, like 3 times. Would we go to Abu Dhabi in 3 times in 2024 or something like that? Why don't we make some stops at these smaller venues? If you don't know BKFC, you should. It's Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. They are a fighting company that goes to these smaller venues because BKFC is still getting legalized in a lot of states. Anyways, these smaller venues are constantly packed. Not only are they packed, but they are loud, and the fans seem to really enjoy these smaller venues. Not only would it help fans get to see these fighters and build a name for these fighters? But I imagine it would help the UFC make a little bit more money off of tickets and viewership, because I can't imagine they make much of any money off of UFC Vegas fight nights, especially when we have a headliner like Mackenzie Dern versus Amanda Ribas. Honestly, for a lot of casuals, they might not even know that the UFC is returning this weekend because it's a UFC Apex fight night. And as far as I've seen it being promoted on social media and stuff like that, it's almost non existent. Whenever there is a fight night at one of these smaller venues in one of these states, there's a bit more of a build to it. There's a bit more stakes. There's a bit more of a electric feel in the air for the fighters, you know. Crowds really do manipulate a fighter's emotions when they're fighting. Booing, cheering, stuff like that. Now, fighters might say that it doesn't affect him, but believe me, if Michael Chandler fought in the UFC Apex, he would be world champ because that crowd really influences him during those fights. He wants to hear the crowd roar, and I'm sure a lot of other fighters want to hear the crowd roar, except for the Dagestanis. Um, anyways, um, there's again no sort of build up to the fight nights, and although the Apex probably saves them a little bit of production money, they are losing a lot of opportunity to make more fans and really get out there to the general audience. As the UFC keeps growing, it only makes sense to extend the reach to these smaller areas where people really don't get to see UFC fight nights and stuff like that. I can imagine for a UFC fight night too, they wouldn't have to worry about people showing up and attending. They would be super duper packed because people aren't used to a huge event happening for these smaller venues. Now I know there's a little bit of a crowd at the UFC Apex, but it's not much of anything. I think it's about a little bit over 100 people. That really isn't much of anything if we're being completely honest. The crowd effects are just almost non-existent. I can never really hear them, and if I do, it's normally when a knockout happens. Um, but it's just such a disappointing and often kind of depressing to listen to coaches yelling back and forth to each other as their fighters are just fighting to the sound of, air being punched back and forth. You'll hear all right, throw that left hook, the guy's doing the and you hear the guy grunting and throwing and everything, and it was cool at first. It was really cool at first hearing the sounds of the punches and the fighters and the commentators being loud enough to hear each other and stuff like that. It was really fun at first, but now we've gotten to a point of it being pretty stale, pretty boring, and the UFC seems to be on the track of putting these cards on and kind of just, it's a little thing to pay off some of the lower fighters, say that they got them a fight. At the end of the day, these fights don't really matter. We have a ranked number 6 Mackenzie Dern fighting a ranked number 8 Amanda Ribas. As far as I'm concerned, they both have 2 or 3 more wins. Whoever wins this fight, they both have 2 or 3 more wins before they get to title contention. And, it would feel a lot more eventful if we had an event, hell, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Florida Hard Rock Casino. There's a lot of little venues that I know the BKFC goes to that if the UFC went to, it would make the event so much better. It adds a name to the fight night, so it stands out on its own. People will want to go back. Hey, there's an event in New Mexico, or there's an event here. Well, I didn't know that. Let me go back and watch it. UFC Vegas fight night cards they don't matter. They really don't. It just feels like a waste of time. And honestly, for fight fans, it's a huge disservice to be opening up 2025 with putting us in the UFC Apex. If they showed a little bit more love to these smaller venues, get better fan interactions, I'm sure there'd be better fighter viral moments. I'm sure they'd do some crazy things, maybe try some food from the state. Who knows? you can do anything in these smaller venues, but let's not do these UFC Apex events where, oh, Mackenzie Dern brought her dog to the office. Ooh, ooh, like, no, come on, let's get some real fan interactions with people. Let's let's actually go some places for the UFC. Let's stop by some of these smaller Midwestern states, show them some love, because I'm sure the fans would really appreciate it. Versus, I mean, UFC is starting to get to the point where they're really outpricing the fans, especially the Sphere. The Sphere was for Mexicans, but didn't take place in Mexico City, and the tickets were like $2,000, $3,000. That's just insane. Let's get some smaller venues with some reasonable price tickets. That will help out a lot. I think the UFC would really benefit from it. I think the fighters would benefit from it. I think the fans would really, really, really appreciate it. So again, I don't know why we're still in the UFC Apex. It's absolutely ridiculous. I hope to see change in the future. I believe Dana White has mentioned something about getting out of the Apex. I'm gonna try to find the picture of it. I'll post it in the video here to show if I'm right or not. But anyways, I hope they get out of the UFC Apex. And I want to keep making MMA related content for this channel, so keep tuning in. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a prediction video for the main card of UFC Vegas 101. Maybe some prelim fighters. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot of the prelim fighters that are on this card, and I consider myself a little bit above average your casual MMA fan. I'm not saying I'm some, you know, extra Stephen Hawking type esque MMA fan where I know, oh, this contender coming from blah 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 blah. I'm not gonna pretend like I know that. Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you, and I'm gonna tell you who I think's gonna win based off what I've seen, past fights I've seen, on my opinions. If you like that content, please leave a comment, leave a like, hit that subscribe button. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. See ya.